Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today, we are rejoined by Dr. Jim Nichols to continue our discussion about adaptive harvest management. And Jim, it's again a treat for me to be able to speak with you about this. You have invested all of your career into helping us get smarter, make better decisions about duck harvest management. And I hope our listeners realize what a treat it is to be able to hear directly from you about some of the inner workings of adaptive harvest management. It's a component of this enterprise that our waterfowl hunters interact with. It affects them directly, obviously. And to a lot of us, it feels to be somewhat of a black box. And so what I'm hoping, and I'm confident that we'll be able to demystify some of that a bit. So I do hope our listeners appreciate the treat that we have in being able to speak with you at length. I'm sure we're going to have at least two. I know we'll have at least two, if not three, and who knows, maybe even more of these episodes here with you. So thank you, Jim, for joining us again and being gracious with your time.
Oh, thank you. It's a real pleasure for me. And as I said, I really appreciate the opportunity, Mike. Thanks.
Yep, absolutely. On the last episode, we left off where we had introduced adaptive management. You had given us a fantastic definition. We had tried to connect some dots there with how we also use it in some way to learn, to make decisions while simultaneously learning about some of our habitat conservation efforts, but also acknowledge that as it relates to duck harvest management, we have taken it to a much more formalized level. And so that didn't just happen, that there was a lot of time, a lot of intellectual thought, a lot of capacity brought that was invested in making that happen. So that's where I want to pick up today is have you start by telling us who were the people that were responsible for fleshing all of this out. I think there were some technical groups, maybe task forces and working groups that were involved in it. Tell us a little about that. I'm going to assume that you were a key figure in some of those, right?
I don't know if I'd say key, but I was involved in it. I can, to the best of my memory, I can talk about it for sure. Adaptive management was sort of developed by a couple of folks at University of British Columbia, of all things. A guy named Buzz Holling and his student named Carl Walters. They're both really smart guys and came up with this idea of how to manage in the face of uncertainty. It so happened the two management areas that they worked in were forestry for Buzz Holling and fisheries for Carl Walters, but still they developed this sort of omnibus, this program for working in the case of uncertainty, regardless of what sort of management problem you had. So when I came to work first in the 1976 and all these data were laid out and was asked to build models that talked about the effect of harvest regulations on mallards, for example, and came to the realization that just having a lot of data didn't necessarily get you to that answer. I was struggling and kind of looking around, thinking about things to do. Now, as somebody who just gotten out of graduate school, you naturally think of experimental stuff. But of course, experimenting with things like harvest regulations are a lot easier to think about than it is to actually accomplish, because there are a whole lot of other things that people are concerned about with those, in addition to just learning stuff. In other words, learning was not the only objective by a darn long shot, and that's very sensible. So I started reading a little bit of this stuff by Walters and Holling on adaptive management. It made a lot of sense to me. And the part that really made sense to me was this idea of simultaneously learning while you were trying to make smart decisions and manage. In other words, there would be, one sort of school of thought. And in fact, Aldo Leopold actually talked about this a long time ago, was this idea of sort of experimenting with systems until you learned how they worked, and then going ahead and using what you had learned to manage them in the future. So it was kind of a two-step process, and that's real sensible. But in this particular case, where you had ongoing regulations in a program like this, there was no way something like that was going to fly. And so this idea of being able to learn while you were simultaneously managing was one that it made a lot of sense to me. Some people call that the so-called dual control problem. You're trying to do both things at once. So anyway, I started writing about it at the ends of papers and discussion sections and things, saying, hey, this would be a neat way forward. And then that got absolutely nowhere. Nobody paid attention. And so at meetings and things like this, at regulations meetings, I'd start to mention stuff like that more and more, and talk about it. And every time I get a soapbox, somebody was silly enough to let me talk for a while, I'd always mention how trying to implement adaptive management would be a smart thing for us to do with waterfowl regulations. And what I came to realize after 15 years of that is you can talk yourself blue in the face, and it can be as logical sounding as you want, and people wander away shaking their heads and say, yeah, that's a good idea. But there's nothing going to get done unless you have what I've come to call as a champion. In other words, you have to have somebody involved with that is his or her number one thing to do. In other words, they're interested in implementing a program like this, and they have to stick with it from first selling people to the program to then developing it from scratch, and then actually implementing it through at least a few iterations before anything like this can work. So anyway, in our case, it was a guy named Fred Johnson. And if I've got a minute for storytelling, I'll do that here. So Fred was a state waterfowl biologist. He got his master's at Texas A&M, and then went on to be a duckhead in Florida. Basically, he was on the Lake Okeechobee, and he was roaring around in airboats and catching Florida ducks and ringneck ducks at night. And he was just having a good time. He and I collaborated on some stuff while he was a state guy. And then Fred became a Fed. Basically, in 1990, Fred made the change and came to the Office of Migratory Bird Management. They recognized him as a kind of an up-and-coming, really bright fellow who was interested in management issues. And so the group there at Patuxent that deals with aerial surveys, the banding data, things of this nature, they hired him, and they were very happy with that. So anyway, Fred, I'll always remember this. It was in 1990, and Fred went to his first regulations meeting, where after all the Flyway meetings, you have a regulations meeting in Washington, in Washington, D.C., in the Interior Building, and you meet with various heads of state agencies and stuff, and you come back. Basically, the formal regulations are sort of developed in those meetings. Now, a lot of the time, a lot of the background work occurs beforehand, but basically that's when it's sort of legally happens. Anyway, Fred came back from from a couple of days of regs meetings in Washington and sat in my office, and he made the comment. He said, if regulations are still set in this way, by the time I retire, I'm going to view my career as having been a failure. And so anyway, he knew that I babbled about adaptive harvest management a lot, and he started talking to me about it more seriously, as though this is something that ought to be implemented. And I was, as much I, grabbed my pom-poms, I was as much of a cheerleader as I could possibly be. But still, I couldn't help thinking when he walked out of my office kind of fired up that this is really a shame in a way, because I don't, I'm betting there's so much inertia. It would be really difficult to get this thing implemented. But by gosh, if he's got the energy, I'll certainly help. Anyway, he did have the energy, and the sucker made it happen, and he made kind of all the right decisions along the way. So you asked about root working groups and technical groups. So one of the very first things he did was establish a working group just to explore the idea of adaptive management, basically to introduce it to a bunch of folks, and then to begin to think about how it might be implemented with waterfowl. And so this is not something that came from on high. Nobody at a higher level said, Fred, this is something you really ought to explore implementing it. He recognized it himself, and he took it upon himself to develop this group. And the group membership was a really big deal. He dragged some of us in from, I was a research guy that was involved. Ken Williams was a guy who was involved from research as well. And he made some key invitations to state management guys. You mentioned Dale Humberg. Dale was one. Jim Ringelman, who became a DU guy, was one from Colorado. A guy named Jeff Lawrence from Minnesota. I ought to remember more of them than I do. But the point is, he was interested in sort of open-minded state representatives to come and listen to these ideas. He didn't want yes men at all, but he wanted people who would at least pay attention to ideas and consider them carefully. And then we had Dale Caswell from the Canadian Wildlife Service as a representative as well. And so anyway, the working groups, my recollection is Fred got them together about twice a year, starting in 1990, I think. And with the idea of trying to prepare sort of a blueprint for a program, an adaptive management program that might work. We developed to the point where we actually came up with something that we thought would be useful as a proposal by 1993. And in 1993, so Fred published a paper in a special session in the North American Wildlife Conference on it, Natural Resources and Wildlife Conference, dealing with how we, sort of a summary of all the things that had gone on in the working group is sort of recommending how we might approach an adaptive management program for the harvest of waterfowl. And then we had this meeting in South Carolina. Tommy Strange was a waterfowl biologist in South Carolina, hosted us in an old plantation there. But the interesting thing about the meeting was it was designed to basically roll out this idea to a broader group. And again, there wasn't any sort of buy-in by Fish and Wildlife Service by anybody. It was just Fred and his working group. It was at least the meeting was designed to see if some other folks who thought hard about ducks and waterfowl and who were also smart folks would buy into it, or if they would just say, "Nah, this is really stupid. Just go home and you kind of shouldn't have been doing this." So anyway, that meeting occurred, and two of the key people, I'm trying to remember if there was anybody else, but David R. Anderson, who was certainly one of the pioneers of just about every aspect of modern day waterfowl management we can think of, he was asked to render a judgment about this, about the potential for the program. And so was Doug Johnson. And both those fellows were, became Aldo Leopold Award winners. I mean, they're really smart fellows, but who had not been involved in the development of the process itself. And so what we did is we prepared, meaning just members of this working group, had prepared this report, given the report to Doug and David and to all the other people who were invited to this sort of larger rollout group. We made our presentations, and then at the end, David and Doug Johnson and I think some other folks as well made their presentations about what they thought of the program. And luckily, they highly endorsed it. They thought it made sense, and it was absolutely worth trying. They weren't at all certain that it would, that Fish and Wildlife Service could be talked into it, but they liked the idea. So we ended up being very pleased with that.
So the reaction was favorable there. Well, what were the next steps after that? What happened then?
Okay, so now we had this program, and we had a lot of the folks in the waterfowl community that we really respected who thought it might be a good idea to consider implementing this. But having an idea like that and actually getting a large agency such as the Fish and Wildlife Service to actually adopt it are two very different things. And so basically this idea we continued to develop it. The working group, Fred continued to have the working group meet over the next couple of years, but it wasn't implemented. And then in 1994, the hunting season of 1994-95, one particular state did an end run around the normal regulations process and got some, I think it was days added to their season at the end of the hunting season. And as you can imagine, there were a lot of states, in fact, about 48 of them probably, that wrote to the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service being upset about this. And to the point where the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service was looking for anything possible that she could use to as a new way of setting harvest regulations where this kind of thing could be avoided. And so what happened is, because we had this approach and we're ready to roll it out, there was a special sort of a one-day session with Molly Beatty, who is the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service at that time. And Ken Williams and I, who were members of this working group that Fred Johnson had put together, actually made a presentation to Molly Beatty and some other key people associated with the international fish and wildlife folks. And anyway, made a presentation. And I think if we would have talked about anything at all, I think I could have spoken in another language that she didn't understand. And as long as at the end we said this was an approach that was objective, it's transparent, and it's scientific, and it's defensible, I think she would have said, yeah. Anyway, she, once again, she did accept it and said, yes, this is the way we're going to go forward with the next regulation cycle. We're going to go ahead and implement a program that gets rid of this ability of a state to make an end run and do things completely for political reasons. And so in a sense, I think we just got lucky. And because of this occurrence, it created this this interest of the Fish and Wildlife Service in doing something that was not only different, but more defensible and objective. And so in that case, we got really lucky by this sort of snafu in the regular process.
So, Jim, just to remind our listeners, this idea of the federal government saying this is the way we're going to do this going forward. This, we talk a lot about the states and the federal government collaborating in the harvest management setting process, but at the end of the day, the legislative authority and responsibility for the management of migratory birds falls with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We've talked about that from the very beginning with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the states obviously have a vested interest in this resource. They're a critical part of this, but that meeting that you spoke about was essentially the Fish and Wildlife Service, again, the agency with the legislative responsibility to manage this resource, saying, this sounds like a better approach. It will help us avoid some of these problems that we've experienced here this year. And so this is the federal government decided this is the way we're going to do it. Now, that's not to say that the interest of the state and the buy-in of the states was discounted. That certainly wasn't the case, because you talked about having some state representatives, some state agency representatives on this working group. And so you realized from the very beginning that it needed to be sort of a collaborative approach. But at the end of the day, that decision on whether to use AHM as the process by which regulations was set rested with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, correct?
Yes, that's correct. But your point was an excellent one. I was a little bit facetious there, trying to be a wise guy when I said all we had to do was say it was objective and transparent. The fact that we had these meetings, in other words, the fact that the working group consisted of key state representatives from every single flyway, and the fact that we had undergone this meeting in South Carolina where we rolled it out to a larger group, that absolutely the key audience there was state folks and then smart other folks who knew a lot about duck populations. Those were very, very relevant, I'm sure, in her decision to go ahead and implement this. They weren't being ignored. In other words, that was very important. This was not a sort of a monolithic thing that was just done by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Without that state buy-in, I don't think, number one, we wouldn't have proposed it. But number two, I don't think it would have been accepted. You're right.
Jim, I think at this point we can step into some of the individual components of AHM. As I introduced here, we want to demystify it to some extent. I think this discussion of how it came about, the involvement of the state and federal agencies collaboratively in investigating and presenting this idea is to me, it's fascinating. I get to learn about some of this, but here in just a minute, because I did think of one other question I wanted to ask you. Here in just a minute, we're going to begin to step into some of the individual components of adaptive harvest management. Let me ask you this question. You talked about Fred as being probably the lead champion for this effort. Were you involved Were you involved much in presenting this new idea to the state agency partners or any other individuals or groups, whether it be at Flyway meetings or any other groups? And if so, what was their reaction?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Fred was the champion, the leader of this whole thing. There wasn't any question about that. But yeah, I had a role in that, and in fact, that's my recollection is that that I went to a couple of them. Basically, we had folks from that working group who were designated to make presentations about the full adaptive management program at each one of the Flyway meetings. And my recollection was I went to a couple of them that either the first or second year after they were adopted for exactly that reason. And in no case was I the only person there, but I was there was usually two or three of us. And once again, the ideas hadn't been they weren't completely new to folks at the Flyway meetings, because as we said, we'd had in this working group representatives from each Flyway. And in fact, they were making these sort of periodic, at every Flyway meeting, they'd make a sort of a presentation about the progress and sort of the stuff that was going along. That's another thing Fred did was just remarkable. There's no way I'd have been smart enough to do this, but he had somebody associated with communications, a guy named Dave Case, who, he had a group who was specifically involved in communications for natural resources issues, and Fred was smart enough to do that right from the very beginning. And so Dave was another person who would spread himself around or have folks be sure that they were involved in communicating these ideas at the Flyway meetings and elsewhere as well. So communication was a big deal. I wouldn't have been smart enough to think of it, but Fred absolutely had that in his head from the beginning.
Well, thanks, Jim. But this time, I think we will start to delve into what I'm calling them here, some of the fundamental components and premises of adaptive harvest management as is specific to this conversation. You talked earlier about uncertainty and how that's sort of it's a pretty key aspect of this, us not knowing with 100% confidence how the system operates and how it responds to the decisions that we make, harvest management decisions being the example here. We won't touch on that too much more at this time, but what I do want to spend some time on is talking about the objective. We've introduced this already, but the idea that if you're going to make a smart decision, you have to be pretty clear about the objective that you're trying to achieve. And that's sort of fundamental to this. So talk a bit about the objective, either as it operates within this management context or specifically with regard to what was ultimately chosen in those early days as the objective for harvest management that ultimately drove this AHM process.
Okay. Well, first, I'd like to emphasize sort of your general point about, in general, why objectives are a big deal, and they really, really are. And so my claim would be in any decision process, basically everything is driven by the objectives. In other words, all the other components that we'll go through, sort of the different actions you can take, the models of the system, the monitoring, and some kind of decision algorithm, all those things are dependent on what you set up as your objectives. And indeed, that should make sense. I mean, how can you tell if you're doing a good job or not if you can't measure it against some stated objective that you're trying to achieve? I mean, that's the whole basis for management. So setting objectives is a big deal, point one. Point two, it's interesting to me that that sometimes, anyway, there's a subset of people who will say, well, the objectives ought to be driven by the science, right? And in fact, even it reminds me of with COVID today, people will often talk about decisions being driven by the science. And that's not really true. Decisions should be driven by objectives, and objectives are not dictated to you by science. In other words, they're things that are part of human values, your values, what you value, what I value, and are placing those in coming up with some sort of thing that we're trying to achieve that seems important to us. And so they're absolutely not driven by science. Now, the actions that you take and the stuff that sort of follows can be driven by science, but the objectives is something that comes out of our human values and our minds and what it is that we value. Okay, so for the adaptive harvest management, this was one of the things that I recall a lot of different discussion about about what objectives ought to be in the initial working group. In fact, in particular, I remember Jim Ringelman, who was a state representative from Colorado at that time, and as I said, later became, of course, a DU guy. We were all very interested in hunter satisfaction. In other words, there was absolutely this idea that bird populations had to do well and do well into the indefinite future, that we didn't want to harm them. But there was very much attention paid to hunter satisfaction and what hunters might appreciate as well. And I remember one of our cases when we were talking about, or one of our sessions, we were talking about objectives. And I remember Jim went back and he said, well, and some of us were advocating that we look at sort of long-term harvest, number of ducks shot, something as simple as that is an objective. And Jim said, well, wait a minute, it's got to be more than that. It's got to be it's got to have to do with hunter satisfaction. So let me go back. And indeed, he went back and did a lot of homework. He sent out a questionnaire to a lot of hunters and got some real good ideas about what it is that hunters valued and what they didn't. But his bottom line was that actually harvest was probably a pretty good surrogate for those things that hunters cared about. It wasn't all they cared about by a long shot, but he thought it was a good surrogate for that and recommended that we go ahead and proceed with it. But anyway, what came then out of these meetings where there was an awful lot of talk about objectives and a lot of discussion. And ultimately, what it was decided is that we would look at harvested ducks over a long-term, and in our case, sort of infinite, forever and ever time horizon. Now, why would we say it like that? Well, if you say that I'm going to go ahead and I want to harvest as many ducks as I can, and I want to do it over a 10-year period, then what do you do on that last year? You kill every last duck you possibly can because you don't care about the next year. In other words, so by putting it on a long-term time horizon, it not only values harvest, it not only values the things that hunters were interested in, but it also says that every single year, I want to maintain a duck population that allows that next group of hunters in the next year to also have some success. And so basically the objectives that was used for the program was to maximize harvest over an infinite time horizon is the way we phrased it, meaning you always were leaving enough ducks so the duck population was not in trouble. And then there was also, because there had been sort of some goals, if you will, about what nice waterfowl populations would look like that had been developed by folks who had developed the waterfowl management plan, North American waterfowl management plan a few years prior to the establishment of AHM. There was the adaptive harvest management. There was this idea that maybe we ought to take into account their goals as well. And so there was something built into that maximized harvest that said, well, we're going to devalue harvest when it comes to years when projected population size next year is lower than the goal that was expressed in the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. And so, again, the sort of main goal was maximize harvest, but with this caveat that when waterfowl numbers got below what we sort of thought we would like to see, then we were going to devalue harvest, thereby trying to make regulations a little more conservative when that happened. So, and there have been arguments through the years about the whether or not that was a smart or relevant thing to do, but nevertheless, that's sort of the way things shook out.
With that discussion about our objectives, let's talk now about one of the other really important aspects of this, and I believe this is referred to as a set of regulatory alternatives. We think of it as sort of the regulatory package, whether it be closed, restrictive, moderate, or liberal. Talk to us about those. What's the importance of having regulatory alternatives in an adaptive management system and specific to this AHM?
Sure. Well, if you think of any decision process, basically what is the decision involve? What's the outcome of the decision? It's basically I want to know what action is smartest for me to take at this particular point in time. And so that naturally means that you ought to have multiple actions. And the whole objective of the entire process is to select that action from the alternatives that you have that ends up getting you closest towards proceeding toward the objective that you've set. And we've already talked about what that is. And so in this case, all we had to do was say something about the different kinds of things that, different kinds of actions that could be taken. Now, when you talk about harvested systems, often your mind goes straight to harvest rates. In other words, I could say, well, let's say we have a hunting season that takes maybe 10% of the adult male mallards, or it takes only 5% of a particular age sex class. We can make statements like that, but in reality, what kind of thing does the Fish and Wildlife Service do? Well, it can't specify an exact fraction, an exact harvest rate, an exact proportion of birds that start out to fall flight that end up being shot. You can't do that. What you have at your disposal is the hunting regulations. And so basically these were what we did was select 4 different regulatory packages, where basically each regulatory package was simply defined by 2 key elements. One was season length and one was bag limit. And the idea was here a fair amount of thought was in discussion was devoted to this, but not nearly as much as to the objectives, because the idea was just to look at times in the past. So it didn't have to be this way, but folks looked historically at very sort of lean years for ducks and very, very good years, looked at regulations that were established during those times, and just based sort of packages then, the 4 different packages on things that had been done historically when times were really, really good, really, really bad, and somewhere in the middle. And so what came about then were these regulatory packages, which actually included a closed season. And there's been a lot of talk about the degree to which that was a smart or dumb thing to do. We've never approached it, so that's the good news. But that was indeed incorporated into the original set. And then the 3 that we expected to have the most, that we expected to really be choosing among all the time were a set of fairly liberal regulations, a set of moderate regulations, and a set of fairly restrictive regulations. And again, they were restrictive and liberal with respect to those 2 key elements, season length and bag limits. And we did so retaining, just for historical reasons, not for other additional analysis or science-based reasons, but other than the science that led to the history, but we retained kind of the differences among the flyways that we've been sort of using in the past. So in other words, each one of the flyways, Pacific, Central Mississippi, and Atlantic, each had when you talked about liberal regulations, they were slightly different in each one of those, consistent with sort of the way past regulations had been. But that was the idea, was to just have those mainly 3 different packages.
Jim, with respect to the season length and bag limit combinations that make up these regulatory packages, the restrictive, moderate, and liberal, what was the analysis? What type of analysis was conducted, or what type of analytical work was done to say these are the season length and bag limit combinations that we want to assign to these different packages? You talked a bit about how some of it was based in part on past experience, but what other type of analytical work was done to support those?
So the past experience was important in the sense that they were sets of regulations with which we'd had experience. And because we had experience, we could go back and actually ask questions empirically. In other words, we could say, okay, with this particular set of regulations, there were several different years that we applied it. Now let's look at what harvest rates were, what fraction of birds that start out to fall flight end up being shot by hunters in years with that set of regulations. And we'd have several years to look at. And we had those for these 3 different classes, if you will, for the for the liberal, for the restrictive, and for the moderate. And that was the harvest rates that were produced were, number one, they were within our experience. We'd seen those before. And number two, they covered a range that seemed sensible to us. In other words, the liberal regulatory packages were producing harvest rates that we didn't want to we didn't want to go too much beyond those. In other words, they were sensible endpoints, and so we ended up using those. And the other thing to say is that rather than just saying, well, let's pick the number of days in the season, or let's pick a bag limit and allow those things to vary almost continuously, as opposed to having, in this case, 3 or 4 packages. Once again, we thought this enhanced our ability to learn, in the sense that we would have the ability to see multiple realizations of what happened with each one of these regulatory packages, thereby gaining the experience with the harvest rates that actually came from them. In viewing that kind of learning is sort of useful to proceeding with managing the smart way in the future.
Jim, that's probably a good place for us to wrap up. We still have a lot to cover, and we'll ask you to come back and join us on another episode. So thank you, Jim. We'll catch you on the next episode.
Thanks very much, Mike.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Jim Nichols. We greatly appreciate his expertise on adaptive harvest management and making us all smarter in that regard. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, our digital warrior, for all the work that he does on this podcast. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your support of the podcast. Thank you for spending your time with us. And we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.